Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Henry Wallace Center here at the FDR Library. I'm Paul Sparrow, the director. I'm so glad to see you all today. We got a good turnout for booze. And it hasn't started snowing yet, so we're all safe. I appreciate all of you coming. If you're a member, raise your hand. There we go. You see, your support makes programs like this possible, and I really do appreciate it. It's very important that we give back to the community, and this use of the facility as a place to hold these free programs to the public is one of the ways we do it, and your support makes that possible, so thank you. Today is an interesting day. It is the anniversary date for beginning of Prohibition, and we have with us here today one of the great experts. I just read a quote about him. What did it say? It said he is the undisputed champion of chronicling American presidential campaigns. Undisputed champion, that's pretty good.
That's right.
He's written,
Which means I'm not taking any new matches.
he is 48 books, you said, approximately?
Right about. I mean, some for kids, some for little kids, medium-sized kids, sports encyclopedias, regular history, sports history. So by on average, I say they're average.
Anyway, this is David Pietrusza. He's been here at least 5 or 6 times, and some of his most recent books, TR's Last War, that came out just 2018, right?
That's right.
1932, Rise of Hitler and FDR. You've written a couple books on Calvin Coolidge. And then 1920, the year of 6 presidents, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But you have a unique perspective in the way you cover that history, essentially from the mid-1910s all the way through Truman's campaign and into later, but also an understanding of the culture behind it. So let's start with why we're doing this program today.
Because it's the 100th anniversary of when Prohibition went into effect. The amendment had passed a year beforehand, but there was a year's grace period, which was a mixed blessing for all concerned. It was a great blessing if you had money and a big cellar to put booze in. Okay, Samuel Gompers, who was the president of the American Federation of Labor, talking about culture, said it was that grace period and the fact that you could own liquor. That, people think, oh, you couldn't drink, you couldn't have liquor then, and that's not true. It was a very narrowly defined prohibition where you could not manufacture, transport, or sell intoxicating liquors. So that became also a bone of contention later on when they want to repeal Prohibition. Well, you can't get drunk on beer or wine. Well, I've seen evidence to the contrary.
Raise your hand if you disagree with that.
That was the theory when they crossed their hearts and hoped to die when they legalized that back in 1933 again.
So today is also somebody's birthday. Whose birthday is it?
Well, it's first off, it's Arnold Rothstein. We'll go chronologically. He was a gangster who put together, and gambler and moneylender, and bankrolled the bootleggers and rum runners in the New York City area. You've probably seen him if you've seen Boardwalk Empire. He's a character on that. But most prominently, it's also Al Capone's birthday.
Happy birthday, Al!
It was his 21st birthday, and so that was his birthday present. Congratulations, Al! You can't drink legally.
And I think he found a way around it. So we're going to go back in time a little bit because, of course, the temperance movement, the anti-alcohol movement, didn't start in the 20th century. It actually started in the 19th century. Talk a little bit about the origins of temperance, how the Civil War affected it in the early days, and then how it gained momentum.
Well, as they used to say, you can't drink the water. So you couldn't drink the water back then. It wasn't safe. And what was a lot safer was beer and wine and hard liquors. And so people took that to heart, and they were drinking immense amounts of booze in the 1830s, where it was a sort of permanently sozzled culture. And people began to react to that. There's always an action and an opposite reaction. The reaction first starts in Maine, in Portland, and they ban booze in that state, and the movement spreads. New York State had prohibition in the 1850s, enacted it on their own. You wouldn't think we'd do something like that, but we did. But with abolition and the Civil War, the movement just loses steam. And it doesn't get up and running again until like the 1880s. There's a brief movement then. Rutherford B. Hayes is a teetotaler. They don't allow booze in the White House. And it fades again into the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Hundreds of thousands of women who are seriously cheesed off at what their husbands are doing.
Just like today? No.
Just like today. And so they're going into saloons, the husbands are, the boyfriends are. And the saloons are not necessarily good places. This is where you get your paycheck cashed. And this is where you would leave a good bit of it. So they leave some of their paychecks there, their money there, they'd be liquored up, they might come home drunk, abusive, and they might come home with something they picked up in the back room of the saloon or upstairs, a social disease. And for all of these reasons, this big women's movement starts. Probably the most famous, you could say Frances Willard of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and a whole bunch of other names which you probably don't know, and I've forgotten. But Carrie Nation, the woman with the hatchet, going into the saloons first in Kansas and then the rest of the country and smashing up the bars and the liquor bottles and all that. But an axe will only go so far. You need an organization to affect real change, and the prohibitionists, and there's always a difference between the temperance movement of like, okay, just I'm not going to drink, I'm going to drink sensibly, or we're going to prohibit. And so the prohibition movement gets its own 501c3, okay, called the Anti-Saloon League, probably in the 1890s, kicks up when it recruits this organizational genius called Wayne B. Wheeler, and a political genius. And he's going to manufacture or invent or refine basically single issue voting. If you're with me, I'm with you. And it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or even whether you drink or even if you fall down drunk. But if you will vote with me, we will support you. And if you don't, we will cut your throat. So that by the time of the Progressive era, the World War I coming, the Prohibitionists have in Congress a majority, and national prohibition, which has already been, already been prohibition in various states, quite a few states by the time national prohibition comes along, but it's about ready to pop nationally.
And the prohibition movement actually is intertwined with the women's suffrage movement because there's so much overlap between the Women's Christian Organization and the women who are trying to get the right to vote. And that was also putting pressure on Congress, right, knowing that starting in 1920, the women were going to be able to vote.
Yeah, constitutional amendments tend to come, grow in bunches like bananas. And think of it, I mean, the Bill of Rights, 10 all of a sudden come in a package after the Civil War, the civil rights for blacks come in, and then what happens in the progressive era, you have the Income Tax Amendment, the direct election of U.S. senators, the 18th Amendment, which is prohibition, the 19th, which is women's suffrage. And not only are the 18th and 19th Amendments connected to him, so is the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax. Because once upon a time in this country, we had the quaint idea that we had to pay for our government in some way. And so we might pay for it by tariffs, that was a big source of income, or we might pay for it by excise taxes, which were largely on alcohol. And then when the income tax comes in, it removes the pressure to raise so much money on by the tariff or also on booze. So before that, it's like, well, if we don't have booze and we can't tax it, how are we going to pay for the government? With the income tax, all of a sudden we can. And so all those three things are connected. And with World War I, you also have the fact that many of the brewers, the great majority of the brewers in this country, were German. And their loyalties were suspect. And they were also pushing back not only against the prohibitionists, they were pushing back against women's suffrage because the enemy of my enemy, etc., etc. So it's a very complex package of politics, and many of the wisest politicians try to stay out of it as much as possible.
How did the rest of the world look at this movement in the United States?
It was not unique. It was not unique. Canada enacts prohibition province by popular vote. Every province except Quebec, which is the French Canadian Catholic province. In World War I, alcohol sales are restricted but not abolished. In Germany, of all places, in the United Kingdom, when war breaks out in 1914, the Tsar bans alcohol in Russia. You wonder why there was a revolution, okay? And more to the point, the communists, the Bolsheviks, keep it until the early 1920s. When the Bolsheviks have a revolution in Hungary, they put prohibition in. There's prohibition in Norway. There are, of course, and to this day, prohibition in the Muslim, the Islamic countries, in about a dozen countries to this day. And in 1922, Sweden barely misses putting it in after our experiment is in. Their referendum just misses.
So after the 18th Amendment passes, it gets ratified much faster than people suspect.
Yes.
Wasn't there a little bit of, well, we'll pass it, but they'll never ratify it?
There was a poison pill in the amendment, which is for the first time, there was a time limit. And the time limit was 7 years. And some people would say, well, we could vote for this because they're not going to be able to do this in 7 years. It's going to take a long time. But Wayne Wheeler from the Anti-Saloon League is thinking and saying, this country is changing. And the census is changing, and the representation is changing. There's more people pouring into the cities, into the urban areas. There's people pouring in from Central Europe, Southern Europe. They're not going to want prohibition. So let's roll the dice. If it's not in 7 years, it's never. But because of the anti-German sentiment, because of the rising suffrage women's movement, because of the need to conserve grain for World War I, and also because, what am I trying to think of? I'm trying to think of something. I completely flunked as to where I was going.
But how long did it actually take?
What it really takes is, it took about a year. Nebraska was the last state that came in, and with Nebraska, in 21 states, which vote on the Prohibition Amendment, there are no negative votes. It is completely unanimous for prohibition. It is a big deal. And you take a look, it's also a progressive movement. Some of the more famous reactionaries, shall we say, in the United States Senate, like Henry Cabot Lodge or Senator Boyce Penrose of Pennsylvania, are no votes. But the progressives like William La Follette or Hiram Johnson, William E. Bora, George Norris, these are all votes for prohibition. The big sponsor is a Texas Democrat named Morris Shepard. Again, a very progressive guy.
So the amendment passes, and our now 21-year-old Al Capone sees an opportunity, as do a number of other people, in how they can make money off this. So what starts this, we'll call the Roaring '20s, the gangster era? How does that really pick up steam and get going?
These guys were not exactly innocents. There are a few famous bootleggers who were respectable folks who just sort of blundered into it because of economic circumstances. But, you know, Al has his scar before January 17th, 1920. He's a bad boy. And there had been a criminality, gangs. To say that Prohibition creates gangs, not true, but the gangs are different. They're often, you know, just thuggish people for the protection rackets. You know, if you don't want your store window broken, or your building set on fire, your push cart overturned, you pay off to us. Or they're operating brothels, prostitution, things like that. But the big money comes in with Prohibition, the potential for profits, for a high yield. And since these guys are operating illegally, well, this is what you go into. Not everyone wants to go into it, as a matter of fact. Big Jim Colosimo in Chicago was not too crazy about it, but a couple of newcomers from New York, Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, do muscle in. And one of the problems is the gang warfare. Chicago there are over 400 unsolved gangland murders in Chicago during Prohibition. And that is one of the things which is going to help unravel support for Prohibition, this gangland violence. Chicago is, you know, Colosimo is killed by Torrio and by Capone. About 5 years later, Torrio is shot up and he decides to get out of brackets. He turns it over to Capone, who is still in his mid-20s. But the other gangs don't go away. And Capone gets his vengeance on the people who shot up Torrio, the famous Dion O'Banion, who was killed in a flower shop, his flower shop. He's knocked off. Jaime Weiss, if you go to Chicago, there's the Holy Names Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral there, still has pockmarks in the outer walls from the bullets where he was shot. Jaime Weiss, by the way, was not Jewish. He was Polish, okay? But his name was so long, I guess it wouldn't fit in the obituary. So, no, I'm just making that up. His name was Henry Chmielewicz or something like that. And Bugs Moran, the Bugs Moran gang is battling Capone. And in 1929, we will see the famous St. Valentine's Day massacre, where some men disguised as police in police uniforms pull up to a garage and line members of the Moran gang up against the wall and simply machine gun to death. That's what the headline writers say. Murder turned into massacre at that moment. And it was just one of those things which sickened the public, in part because there were such grisly photographs of it. And the year before, because of the gangs, the Republicans in Illinois had what was called the pineapple primary. Pineapple was a slang for a hand grenade. So the two rival factions, the Capone-backed faction of Mayor Big Bill Thompson is fighting a faction led by the United States Senator Charles Deneen, and they're throwing bombs at each other. 50 buildings and homes are bombed, including Deneen's. It's an ugly, ugly time in Chicago.
So one of the persistent myths is that Joe Kennedy made his fortune as a bootlegger during this period. How would you like to address that myth?
Not true. He really signs up. He makes his money in the Wall Street racket, shall we say. He gets out before 1929. He has this great facility for making money and getting out at the right time. Right after getting out of Wall Street, he puts his money into the film industry and flips that in a couple of years. So he's always making sound moves, and then from that he moves largely into real estate and into basically legal booze, but highly lucrative booze even then. The big name guy who makes his money importing booze into America starts during Prohibition. Actually, he starts bootlegging when Canada has Prohibition, and that's the patriarch of the Bronfman family, Samuel Bronfman, which eventually runs into Seagram's.
And they still have a pretty good business going there with that. So once the Roaring 20s are going, and this underground economy emerges around speakeasies and smuggling. My great-grandfather, who was an oysterman on Long Island Sound, used to grow grapes in his backyard and make wine. And my mom tells the story that every year the revenuers would come and they would measure how much wine he had and how much sugar he used, and they would sign it off and they'd have a glass of wine and they'd leave, because it was perfectly legal
You could
to grow your own.
You could make 200 gallons of wine in your home. But again, this would get twisted by the bootleggers. In Chicago, there was another mob called the Jenna Brothers. There were 6 of them. And what they would do is they would put the arm on all the Italians in this one neighborhood, and they'd be pumping out all this wine, which then would be sold. So you could, those 200 gallons, you know, it was fine for you to make it, it was fine for you to drink it, but just don't take it off the premises and sell it. You could also make hard cider. This would benefit the farmers. So there were a lot of loopholes in this law. It was not strictly no booze, never. And that's one of the problems, which leads to enforcement, which was, shall we say, negligible on almost every level.
Right, so the Untouchables has this, myth around the great, Fed agents who came in and busted up these mobs. But in fact, the FBI didn't really exist at that point.
The FBI wasn't involved, and Ness would have been with the Treasury Department. When Prohibition starts, they hire 1,500 agents to patrol the entire country. Now, they were hoping to get cooperation from the states. That was specifically put into the law, but the states weren't all that interested, particularly in New York. Maryland, New Jersey, no cooperation whatsoever. And with 1,500 agents, these were all patronage employees, and many of them were shady, crooked. They were also ill-paid. They were paid $45 a week. Imagine what you could get on the side in a job like that. Okay, so corruption was quite rampant. I was reading the articles which were coming out about the anniversary today, coming down in the car, and one of them said, and they were repeating an old propaganda story from the repeal folks late in the 20s and the early 30s that said that the federal government spent $300 million on enforcement. No way. Not when it was $100 or $1.5 million to $2 million a year. One of the interesting things, which was right after the 1928 elections, Congress passes a law to increase the penalties. The penalties were so low. First violation was a fine of up to $500. You could make that in a week, bootlegging, if you were lucky. But when they increased the penalties, on the very same day, a United States Senator, who was also a Pulitzer Prize winner for literature, I guess they had better senators then, puts in a proposal to increase the funding for prohibition enforcement to that $300 million mark.